Welcome. My name is Almeda Wright, and I will serve as our host, if you will, for this conversation we are having about Horizons and the REA Journal. But really, we're talking about the future of research and religious education. And so we're taking the time this afternoon, not simply to present ideas or things like that, but to have what we would like to call a dreaming session, a session where we come together and we share from both our joys as well as our concerns about the state of the field and state of publications in the field. And so we're also going to do several different things. We have an ambitious agenda, if you will, for our time together. So I will just give a little bit of an overview and then we'll go ahead and get started. So our plan for this session is that in the first 30 minutes or so of our conversation, we will spend our time dreaming. We're going to have a panel of our wise experts to respond to some open-ended questions about innovations in religious education scholarship and publications. Our panelists for the first third will be Jack Seymour, who has been serving as one of the co-editors of the Horizon series for REA. We will also have Joyce Mercer, who has been serving as our editor for the journal. And we will have Hosffman Ospino, who is our incoming chair of the Horizon series, and as well has been serving as one of the co-editors of that series for several years. In the second third, we're going to move from dreaming to actual publications. We're trying to think about how do we get from these big and amazing ideas that we're going to generate to getting it into print. And so we're going to share some practical wisdom. And there we will return to Jack Seymour, who will give us some understanding of the goals of the Horizon series. We will hear again from Joyce Mercer, who will tell us about the scope of the journal. And we'll have Jose Azaria, who will also talk to us about some of the challenges for international scholars and scholarship, as well as book reviews from Dave Csinos, who is our editor for book reviews for the journal, and Aaron, who will talk to us, who's our editor who's one of our co-editors for the journal, and he will help to share with us about the peer review process. And so all of that will be somewhat brief, but really an attempt for us to share and begin to answer some of the questions that emerge often in the how-to process of what's going on in our scholarship. And then the final third, we will open it up to our attendees for you to share questions or concerns or dreams or ideas, and we will engage in some a considerable time of dialogue and exchange. And so that's our plan for today. Hopefully everything is clear. So now we're going to invite we're going to start with Joyce and Jack and Hosffman, and we're going to invite you all to begin to think about a couple of ideas. Our first question, and I'm going to allow Joyce to start us off, is in what ways do you think the present realities, such as the global pandemic, race, relations and tensions, global migrations, deterioration of environment or consequences, and so many other things, are challenging religious education scholarship and publications? And also to think about, are we doing the research that needs to be done in our field to respond to such realities?
Thank you, Almeda. Hi, everybody. I would say, first of all, the opportunity that's in front of us is to be even more interdisciplinary in our research than we already are, but especially in the form of less in-house research and more publicly engaged research. So, for instance, right now we are called by these various situations in our contexts around the globe to use even more and multiply utilize disciplinary knowledge outside of the intersections of religion and education. But of course, we're called to engage those in relation to the intersections of religion and education, which is not something that people in other fields do when they're working on, for instance, critical race theory. We're uniquely situated to do that. And so attention to context, the demand on us in our research and our publishing is that we have to be constantly reading ourselves into another body of literature in order to do our work well. The opportunity is, okay, I get to learn about eco-theology, and I get to learn about science, and I get to learn critical race theory. And so that's the possibility, how to bring these together. And then to the last question, because there is often a lag time between when an issue becomes current in its public forms, where people are talking about it in the academy, but also where it's actually impacting the lives of folks, and the point at which it moves from just the general public consciousness to something that we as scholars and practitioners of religious education are working on. There can be a lag time in the publication process. And I think that we need to work on getting to the writing more quickly so that we are part of the early conversations about these things. I think we've done that in some ways with the journal. We had a first issue of the 2020 year. It was a COVID issue, or last year was a COVID issue. And we've done some pretty consistent work on race and anti-racism since 2017 special issue. So we're doing it, but I think we can do it more and do it better in terms of more timely, focused, publicly organized topics for research.
Thank you, Joyce, for that. Others of our panel who want to respond.
Well, let me build on what Joyce said. Definitely, I would continue to emphasize the interdisciplinarity of our research in religious education. Our field, naturally allows itself, invites this type of interdisciplinary contextual research, and we need to capitalize on that, by also affirming our relationships with practical theology, with social science, and other fields. That's without a doubt. But when faced with these major questions that you raised, Almeda, like race, for instance, racial justice, or the environment, or large migrations, global dynamics, in terms of economics and so on, I think that our scholarship needs to be careful not to fall into the trap of being merely reactionary, because we sometimes may end up just commenting on something that happened the previous year, and then we somehow move on to something else, So in a sense, we need to start imagining research that is this, through a process of discernment, anticipates, the next steps in the different conversations that we are having. And that's the beauty of the journal, for instance. I think that the journal allows us to discern out loud, in that way. But also the Horizon series, it seems to me that one of my pastimes, and you can tell, how boring I am, is to read dissertations. I love to read dissertations because dissertations, as a matter of fact, are cutting edge research out there. You get the best minds, younger minds, and scholars, that are emerging, exploring key ideas. And I think that that's the type of work that we need to continue to do. How do we imagine taking these ideas and not just merely react to them, but also anticipate, the directions of the field. And in order to do that, this is a conversation that I have had with Joyce in the past. Sometimes it worries me when I read the journal, for instance, that our journal in religious education and other journals in religious education, as a matter of fact, are very creative, and we are constantly opening doors and windows into new research. But what I do not see that much in our journal and sometimes in our publications is conversation among ourselves. I just don't see us reacting to what others say, responding, building on the research. So in a sense, we become lone voices, in the field, screaming here and screaming there, saying something here, saying something there. But we need to start connecting with one another. And I think that, we need to start imagining research that builds upon the practice of small intellectual communities, small research communities that are constantly researching. Even though, in the past, there used to be schools of religious education, schools of thought, you would know where somebody would fit, and there would be, mutual responses. So our research is very fragmented, in our day, which there's a positive element about it, but we need to talk to one another.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for that, Hosffman.
Let me add a couple ideas to the conversation. When the Horizon series was initiated, think about that image, a horizon. Think about what happens when you're walking, hiking, driving a car, as you look at the horizon and how it calls you forth so that you're not just in the place where you are, but you're moving forward, seeing something else, etc. It may be that you see a tornado on your horizon, and you need to do something. The reality is that's happening to Joyce right now with a hurricane coming up from the south. But the image of horizons is that we were hoping to find those works that were calling the field to new endeavors, new possibilities. And I guess I would ask us, what are those? And I agree 100% with Hosffman. We need faster and more interactive conversations. Now, in addition to the idea about horizons, let me add one other. I think our field has forgotten education. I think what happened to me throughout my career is that in mainline Protestant seminary, there's nothing wrong with talking theology. I like it. I enjoy it. It's important. It shapes me. But the reality is I continue to read everything in the theological community and stop reading some of the things that were happening in the educational community. And the reality is, friends, critical race theory and public education is a critical issue for all of us right now. Because what's happening in the United States, it may not be happening elsewhere, but what's happening in the United States is people are trying to take over and control and reform how history is taught. Education and our colleagues in education are struggling with that. We need to add our voice to that. The vision of the Religious Education Association when it started was that the voice of education and the voice of religion would in fact impact each other. I know now, living in Nashville, Tennessee, one of the things that I so enjoy is going to the lectures at Peabody College of Education of Vanderbilt University. And Peabody is raising questions about how education is dealing with race, gender, culture. The same program that, and thank God for the program that Bo Young has brought us, but our education colleagues have also been struggling and in some ways are steps ahead of us in asking how some of those voices are being addressed. So if we want to talk about a horizon, I think one of our horizons is how do we reconnect with not just our colleagues in practical theology and Bible and theology, but how do we reconnect with our colleagues in education? At Northwestern, for example, the religious education was first taught in, let me rephrase that, education was first taught as a discipline in a school of religious education. So there's something about how our fields need to be more interactive with each other, and we need to be more involved in AERA than we have in the past. Just one suggestion.
Oh, I appreciate that. Any other thoughts from our panelists? It's been actually interesting to hear and kind of synthesize the themes that I've heard each of you talking about in terms of the expansion of the conversation, but also the fact that oftentimes we're doing crosstalk and not having conversations with each other. And so I want to flag that as just something that's important to summarize and kind of take away from what you guys are talking about in terms of dreaming, for us to imagine what it's like for us. And because what's interesting is what I'm hearing is also not necessarily us pushing for what's new and create kind of like cutting edge, but also how do we return in new ways to our core values as religious educators or as a religious education association in terms of our roots in education or in conversation with education and schools of theory, but also in terms of our connection and commitment to publicly engaged scholarship or being the type of religious education that is socially and publicly and critically and globally concerned. And so I appreciate all of that. That, of course, brings us to the second question. And the second question that I am going to ask Jack to start us off on, it really continues the first. And that is for us to imagine, where do you see religious education scholarship and research moving, either based on what you've observed in some of your kind of reading of the field, and even what you want to imagine is possible for the direction of the field?
I want to begin by quoting Bo Young on the very first night. Her comment was, "The world is awaiting our guidance and leadership." That we might want to quibble whether the world even knows that we exist, so that it knows whether it's awaiting us. But the reality is, the world is awaiting the resources of religious traditions to talk about what is the kind of future that you and I want to live in. And to me, that's the predominant question that needs to be asked right now. One of the fun things you get to do when you're retired is to attend continuing education classes. And I just got through attending 2 years ago, it was 2 years ago, a class on religion in the South. And one of the most fascinating things I learned about that is, do you realize that 70% of the children in the southern states in the United States are formed by homeschooling and or private schools? This organization is an organization that wants to be expansive, that wants to be inclusive, that wants to invite voices to the table. But the reality is that most practice of religious education that's occurring in the public world right now is defining for people how they live one identity and how they're right and everybody else is wrong. Friends, 70% of the children in the South, I don't know the figures for Midwest, East, West, 70% are formed by homeschooling or formed by parochial. And I'm not talking Catholic here, because most of the Catholic schools are honestly doing public education, not parochial education. So the question is, if that's the case, how do we talk about being a people? How do we talk about caring for each other's values and building a world together, when in fact, many of the educational resources are in fact teaching us how to be isolated and individual and stay in our tradition and not talk to anybody else's tradition? To me, that is the pressing question, and Bo Young had it absolutely right the first night. The world is awaiting our guidance and our leadership. The world needs that guidance and leadership that is inclusive, expansive, and wants to build a world together.
Thank you, Jack. You've said a whole lot. You can see the responses lighting up with hand claps and inspiration. But Joyce and Hosffman, what else might we share or add to what Jack is asking us about or reminding us about the future of RE scholarship and research?
Okay, Joyce. Let me. I mean, it's hard to follow Jack with his wisdom and experience, Jack. But there are a couple of things that that come to my mind, Almeda, when considering and discerning this particular question. My sense is that our field, and particularly the Religious Education Association, already began making that shift. And having been a member of the REA for about 15, 16 years, I have noticed the difference, in the conversations that we've been having. I remember, for instance, the conference that Yolanda Smith put together, or the conference that Mayanne Letrand put together as well, when we began to engage these differences. The 2019 conference that Hannah invited us to, in which we were invited to explore differences and so on. I think that, when we contemplate the question, where do we see research moving? I think that we already have made a turn. We have made a significant turn. And the question is, as the ship continues to move to address these realities, how do we capitalize, about that shift by doing our scholarship, in terms of our teaching, in terms of the research, in terms of the publications. And I think that there are two ways in which we can do this. There is no doubt that as we move forward, conversations that cross boundaries, international boundaries, or inter-ecclesial, inter-religious boundaries, ecumenical, and so on, are going to be more than necessary. Again, going back to the journal, I'm always curious about, I asked Joyce, who's publishing in the journal. And it's fascinating to learn that about 70-80% of the essays that we publish in our journal are published by scholars from outside of the United States of America, which is just amazing, So that, in a sense, it's pointing into the future. How do we become more conversant with Muslim scholars and Jewish scholars, or scholars in Africa, in Latin America, and in other parts of the world? I think that's the potential, the horizon is opening at this particular moment. How do we learn to cross those boundaries in terms of our scholarship, and again, capitalize on that? But on the other hand, looking more internally within the United States, but this doesn't, it's not exclusive to the United States or North America. I'm thinking, for instance, of the mass migration movements that are transforming many of our denominations. I myself inhabit the Catholic world, and immigrants and the children of immigrants are reshaping the entire Catholic experience in the United States. And I think that we need to start listening to these voices and empowering more of these voices, because there's so much to learn, But the question is that if we somehow, going back to the previous conversation, if we become too narrow focused on our particular individual project, we are going to miss the boat, So I would like to see more scholarship, emerging from these marginalized or fresher communities with fresher eyes and fresher questions, renewing our field.
Yes and yes to both of you. And thank you for putting all that out there. There's a lot on the table here from what you've said, to which I would only add, in addition to my affirmation, that I think the moment in research is for us to figure out how to step up and step back around the kinds of scholarship that you're talking about, Hosffman, that it's not simply enough to publish it. We also need to be open to learn from it and with it, and to actually engage it critically. And so, one of the commitments of the journal has always been to nurture the voices of scholars who are newer in the field and to scholars who come from parts of the world that are showing up less in publications. So we continue to do that. And I just think the attitude of stepping up and then stepping back so that we can hear those voices and actually engage them to learn from them is critical. Secondly, yes, we're getting better at engaging issues of race, racism, anti-racism. We are working on that constantly. It's a major commitment of our organization as well. We're seeing increasing numbers of articles that are paying attention to the ecological crisis. I don't see anything coming on my desk about the global migration situation. So if anybody's out there who has any inclination to do some work in this would be a prime area of research. Especially, it seems to me, some of our European colleagues, you all out there, could offer us a lot of wisdom because you're dealing with this in different ways, and hopefully some more point of personal privilege, politically creative ways than we have been able to here in this country for the previous several years. Enough said. So those things. And then last, I would say the research opportunity and the publishing opportunity that is in front of us is in part given to us because of the economic unsettlement that we're in right now. And that is that theological education is shifting, staffing of religious education in faith communities is shifting, and publication itself is shifting. We're going from print to online, all sorts of differences that brings. And that's an opportunity for us to sort out how we can take the lead in helping to equip folks around the big meaning questions in intersection with these issues that we care so much about. Because we can talk about critical race theory all we want to, but if we don't have some vision of what a life worth living looks like, then there's no telos for that to go anywhere. We can't help direct traffic. We can't encourage and collaborate well with others. So I would say doubling our capacities to equip people to address those big questions would be a major agenda.
I appreciate each of you sharing from your wisdom and from the different perspectives. There are a couple questions, of course, that are in the chat. We'll be able to attend to those, some in real time I've seen you responding to, but also definitely in the Q&A period at the end. But also just kind of as a concluding thought, I think as we're dreaming about the future, one of the questions that I am still wrestling with is whether or not, because we've been talking a lot about the Horizon series and the journal, if as an organization, not that we need to take on another thing, if our current publication venues are actually sufficient for these future conversations. And I think I've heard each of you kind of attend to this in the sense of thinking about how to be quicker and sometimes our response, or even more forward thinking in how we create or curate space for dialogue and curate space for these cross conversations and to live into the values that we are researching and writing about. And I think that may or may not begin to really kind of speak into or like attend to like these two arms. So it may be something else that we have to imagine together or dream about together. And yes, our eReach is also part of our REA sponsored publications. Any final thoughts before we shift to some of our practical wisdom? Awesome. So for the next half of the next 30 minutes or so of our conversation, I also want us to move a little bit from our dreaming about the future to our actual getting it into print or getting it. Well, print is it's a metaphor these days, getting it into the world, into the space of something published or written form. And so I want to invite Jack Seymour to come and to talk a little bit about the Horizon series. And so I'm going to drop in the chat the order so our speakers can go and are in that order. So we're going to go Jack, Joyce, Jose, Dave, and Aaron, if that makes sense. So I don't have to come back to each of you. Alrighty, thank you so much.
The Horizon series is just in the midst of publishing its 7th book. Tanya Marie Eustace Campen's book, Holy Work with Children, was published last week. So it just is out. There are 2 additional books in the Horizon series that are being edited and mentored now, so that there's a possibility that we could have 2 major additional manuscripts out in 2022. The focus of the Horizon series is limited. And if I could get off of Horizons for 30 seconds and do a footnote, I think Almeda was absolutely right. I think we need to think about whether we have sufficient venues for publication and how do we need to expand those. Because the purpose of the journal, the purpose of Horizon are focused and limited. And it may be that we need some other places to add to that. The focus of Horizons is to help the voices of newer scholars be published. That honors the commitments to interfaith, international, and intercultural that are at the heart of the Religious Education Association. Most of our books have been formerly dissertations. And as many of you know, except for Hosffman, most people don't like to read dissertations. And dissertations, honestly, are written for the reviewers, not for the world. That's truthful, friends. They're written for the reviewers, so somebody can pass, rather than being written for the world, even though the topics are important for the world. So what Horizons tries to do is every time we look at an idea that primarily comes from dissertations, we tell somebody whether we think the book can in fact be a public book that will in fact publicly contribute. And that's reviewed early on. If we think the book would be better as an article, if we think it would be better as a blog, we tell the person that from the very beginning so that they know how they can take their ideas into the public. And one of the things that Horizons did about 5 years ago was to create a group, an editorial board, and that editorial board is vested with some very significant people who can be helpful mentors. So every time we agree to review a manuscript and accept a manuscript, we provide a mentor for someone to help them in the process of turning that book from a book for the committee to a book for the public world. And we think that has been absolutely true in most of the books that are out there in the Horizon series right now. What I would like to say, and I bet Hosffman would agree with me, we want to encourage you to submit your dissertations and ideas to one of the co-editors, Elizabeth Conde Frazier, Mayan Latron, Hosffman Ospino, or me, to share your ideas with us, and we will review them as fast as we can to give you some help and guidance in next possible places where you could publish, because we want to expand. And the process, honestly, with Wittgenstock has speeded up. We're now, from the time there's a final manuscript to the fact that that manuscript is edited and formatted and published, is less than 6 months. So the reality is, what takes the longest is taking that dissertation that you're tired of writing and turning it into something that nobody's tired of reading. And that's what the hope of the series is. So let's move on.
Thank you, Jack. The journal, a couple of practical things. One is to recognize the focus of the journal as well is necessarily limited, and yet that doesn't mean it's not changeable. It's malleable, but it's malleable within a certain charge, and that is that we publish original research and scholarship at the intersections of religion and education. In that work, of course, many topics are there, but that is our basic mandate. And so one of the main things that we do is to shape and respond to scholarship in the field. And we have the opportunity to do that these days globally. And it happens more quickly because we are able to publish electronically far in advance of when we get the print version out. And so, for instance, if you submit an article to the journal and it is accepted for publication, once the page proofs are dealt with, it's going to be there on the website in the electronic form as early as the next day. I mean, it happens really fast. So that's changing our situation. The other thing that I just want to say is that we can only publish what you send us. And so much of our material comes from people who are not in this association. And I wonder why that is. I remember when Jack was the editor, he wondered why that was, and Ted wondered why that was before Jack. So this is not a new question I'm asking, but submit your stuff. And we like to publish you. We like to publish within the organization and outside of the organization. One thing about that, really quick, that's just a practical nuts and bolts thing, is it really helps your material move from submission to publication if you read the instructions to authors and follow them. So if you send us an article that's 85,000 words long, our page limit is 6,500. Our word count limit is 6,500. So it's going to take us a lot of back and forth to get that into a manageable size. If you send us things that aren't formatted by the instructions, they can't work with it in the publication end until it's correctly formatted. And so this is a kind of small thing, but it's a big issue if you want to move your material quickly from submission to publication. That is available on the publisher's website, and when I finish talking, I'll put that address into the chat for you, as well as the address for the submissions to the journal. I really want us to keep the kind of diverse voiced conversations going on in the journal, and so I just really want to encourage you to submit whatever you're working on that's your piece of that.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation from this group to talk a little bit about publishing as international scholars or people for whom English is a second or a third language. I have the privilege of being asked to review some article submissions, good quality research, excellent exposition of new ideas, fresh ideas, as we were saying before. It is interesting that we do have a lot of publishing from outside the U.S., but also we have some denials of some of those articles. And for me, it's really, I would say it's sad that sometimes we have to reject something that is so significant when it comes to research because it doesn't fit the ecology of the journal, of the text. So, I claim no particular expertise other than the fact that my own writing is a constant balancing act between, in one side, the important need to keep the integrity of my scholarly voice, which is shaped by my vernacular epistemology, but also shaped by cultural forms of education that precede my PhD work. And on the other hand, making it communicable within a shared textual space where the readership is perceiving the journal as a whole. So one of the practical things that I do, and these are probably helpful not only for international scholars, also people for whom English is a second language or a third language, but also emerging scholars. The first one is I'm sure that I am able to name what type of article I'm writing. As we heard before, the journal is open very comprehensively for many types of research, but sometimes it's difficult to identify what type of research it is. If it's quantitative research design, qualitative research report, it's a combination, it's a theoretical paper, it's an opinion essay, it's a historical piece. So in some way, I always say, once you give birth to an article, name it. Give it a name. And that will help to do two things, I will say. Help you to go back to the journal, to REA, and do some review of articles to look for frequency. Number one, how often have articles of the same type have been published by the journal? That will give me an idea if it really fits the journal. And the other one is looking for some resemblance. While research is always innovative and unique, it's not difficult to find a twin article that have tried something similar methodologically or argumentatively. And then to pay attention to the format, to the organization, to the sentence composition of that article that resembles the type that you're trying to publish. And this is not to copy that, because you don't want to lose that vernacular value of your research, but to notice patterns that are seen as acceptable for publication at the journal. The other thing that I do is, first of all, in reviewing the journal, recognize, as Joyce was saying before, that journals evolve with editorial leadership changes and also the cultural influences that determine the shifts in academic discourse. So be sure that you're reviewing current journals articles. Sometimes your favorite author who have published the greatest article you have read in REA was written 60 years ago. That may not be the best model to follow. The other thing that I want to suggest is always seek feedback on manuscripts. There may be a stage in which you can just write the article and just deliver that for peer review. But look for some feedback from people who have published before for REA or similar journals. Your own second read or proofreading may not be enough because once your brain closes that synapses and has decided that a sentence or a paragraph is correct and it makes sense, you will continue to read it as correct and sensical no matter what it's on paper. So ask that reviewer to look at the article from a perspective of a reader, not an editor. Research shows that problems for international writers for whom English is not the first language are not really grammatical. They're not about grammatical accuracy. It's about coherence and logical sequencing of ideas. And finally, I would say recognize the English language biases. And I will call that because it is not about following a correct idiomatic form, but recognizing that every language has its own biases. And they're cultural in many ways. The biases in English are that, you go deep, but keep it simple. Sentence brevity in summarizing a strong argument are always preferable. The use of active voice, the narrator, the English-speaking narrator is always agent. He or she or they do things to others, rarely receive something. There's a preferential option for the first person singular, the I. Tense is important. Known facts and hypotheses are always in the present while referring to former scholarship or concluded research. It's always a thing of the past. And I'm saying this because in recognizing biases, you can do two things. You can adapt and conform or make your linguistic biases evident and say why. if you're using first person plural, the we as your voice, why? Who is with you writing this article, and why that collective understanding of your research is important. So, as we heard from Joyce before, read the journal aim and scope. Open first, there's a guideline for the journal. And I would say that an article you have written for another journal may have been rejected, or just because it's a journal you read more often than REA and you have accommodated mentally to that journal, that article may not transfer smoothly into REA. I was reviewing the other day a couple of journals in Christian education, and you can certainly see the difference between what is expected in terms of not only content, but format. Read the guidelines. They're very comprehensive, but still there's some cues to what the journal is looking for. And if I have to underline those just to finalize my 5 minutes, it's in the guidelines, it says that the articles that we write for REA should offer insight and be pieces of critique. And I think this is what we have heard in this panel. It is about bringing new ideas to the forefront in ways that we believe will have an impact in the larger public life of not only of the church, but society as a whole.
Thanks, Jose.
Well,
you set me up brilliantly here. I'm Dave Csinos. I've been the book review editor for religious education for the past 3 years, and it's an exciting role, but it's impossible to carry out without the support of authors and reviewers. And so, in my few minutes, I want to pick up on 3 things and highlight these 3 ideas. So the first is why book reviews matter. And the book reviews that appear in each issue of Religious Education aren't simply for promoting new monographs or edited volumes or getting a shorter piece on your CV. They are ways of building the field. They are ways of putting new ideas and methods and sources into the purview of our association and into the very wide readership of the journal. A good book review can shape future trajectories for REA as an organization and for the wider field of religious education. It's impossible to publish a review of every book that deserves the attention of our readers. If we were still doing print journals, our mailing costs would be through the roof if we did that. They would be some thick issues of the journal. But a good book review serves to shine light on fresh scholarly work and innovative approaches to the practice of religious education. And so to this end, they serve to expand the boundaries of the field, to identify new interdisciplinary intersections with other fields like sociology, systematic theology, homiletics, psychology, ethics, just to name a few. And they provide a forum for having some sort of conversation with each other about our research and a conversation with others. So the second thing is, how can you support book reviews in the journal? And there are 3 ways that you as a member of REA can support our book review initiatives. First, you can offer to write a review. Whether you're a graduate student or a doctoral student, a junior scholar, a senior member of REA, you can offer to write a review for us. And in fact, in some of the recent reviews that have yet to be published but are in process, have been written by, I believe, master's students and scholars with 40 years of membership in REA under their belt. And all of them matter. So if you want to write a book review, you can take a look at a running list of titles. You can email me. I keep a Google Doc with a running list of titles that we would like to get reviewed. And you can suggest a title or propose a review essay. We haven't done one of these in a while. There are a couple in the works where you review, we can give you a little bit of space, little bit more space, and you can review multiple titles on a common subject. Second, if you're an author, please let me know about your new titles. I do my best to stay on top of publication by members of REA, but it's always helpful for me to know, for an author to send me news of a recent or a forthcoming publication. Also, if you know a colleague or a friend who has published a new book, please send me a message with this information as well. And third, please consider this, right now, this is an open and an ongoing invitation to welcome doctoral students into the work of REA and into publishing by asking them to write reviews. Writing a book review provides budding scholars with an opportunity to hone critical analytical skills, to improve their writing, gain experience with academic publishing. So if you're a professor who works with doctoral students, please invite them to consider writing a review for us. And so the third thing is, how do you write a book review? So the first thing is probably to contact me, and I will, when I'm done speaking, I'll put the guidelines and that has my contact information into the chat. But it's always good to reach out to me first rather than picking a book and writing a review, because we might actually have a review of that book already in the hopper. So confirm with me that we don't have a review, in process by sending me a quick email. And then with the book, once you have the book and you're good to go, write the review, and I'll stress what has already been said, write the review according to the guidelines on our website. This saves time and energy for everyone. Good reviews include a brief summary of the book, a critique of strengths and weaknesses, and recommendations for who would benefit from the book and how they benefit. And finally, and most importantly, finish the review. And I know firsthand that smaller projects like a 500 to 750 word review often end up at the bottom of our piles of work. But if you agree to write a review, please try to do your best to do so while the book is still fairly fresh. And I know I said three things, but I want to leave just a final word based on something that you actually said earlier in the conference, Joyce, at a panel that you were moderating. The book review section of our journal is a collective enterprise of REA. And so we seek for it to be consistent with who we are as a guild. So our aim is not to tear apart or poke holes in other people's books and arguments. We know many of us here are authors as well, and we know that books are labors of love, and they're offered with humility and vulnerability. And so I want to echo your words, Joyce. We at REA seek to cultivate a community that fosters both critical inquiry and supportive affirmation. Critical inquiry and supportive affirmation. These are the qualities that make book reviews worthy of attention and worth and a service to our wider field. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I'm Aaron Ghiloni, Associate Editor of Religious Education, and it's just so exciting as someone who lives outside of North America to see how globalized our journal is becoming. While a limited number of people can attend an REA conference in North America or attend an online conference in northern time zones, scholars from a vast array of countries, educational contexts, and religious traditions can and do submit to the journal. That's exciting. To illustrate this breadth, right now I'm editing manuscripts on topics as varied as how Buddhism addresses adolescent antisocial behavior, religious education as a sustainer of Kazakh identity in China, poetry as Ethiopian Orthodox pedagogy, use of the Bhagavad Gita in a liberal arts context, and religion in Zambia's national curriculum. So this is invigorating work, and I'm just so delighted that our editor, Professor Joyce Ann Mercer, is committed to publishing the work of underrepresented scholars. So if you're in the audience and that is you, this is a place for you. However, internationalization presents challenges, particularly to the peer review process. And I want to give two reasons for that. First is recruiting qualified reviewers. Internationalization complicates the review process. As religious education expands its scope, the capacity of our catalog of faithful reviewers thins out. As religious education extends its reach, it creates subspecializations and little conversations, which, to be honest, many of us are not trained in. And so as editors, that means we have to seek specialists outside of the association, and by consequence, outside of the conversation. If our journal is to truly be a multi-religious, multicultural, interreligious, international, intercultural journal, we, and by we I speak here of the REA as a whole, we need to actively recruit and empower religious education scholars from non-Christian and non-North American and non-European context to join our work. We have to be invitational and we have to empower them. The second reason the review process is complicated by internationalization is we want to ensure disciplinary coherence. And things have been said about this already by many of the other panelists. Internationalization complicates our notion of what religious education is. Our field is changing. It's becoming less of a field and more of an unfenced countryside. What are the concepts that hold us together as a journal and as an association? So if you're a peer reviewer, it's vital that peer review helps emerging scholars not only build up their own work, but to contribute to our work, to contribute to and advance the 116-volume conversation that's been occurring in this journal. So many of the submissions we receive say something about religion and something about education, but it's not clear that they are about religious education per se. So, for example, we receive numerous manuscripts along the lines of, say, the leadership style of teachers in Islamic school, or the theological beliefs of Buddhist millennials. This kind of article says something about religion and something about education, but the matter of overlap or of integration or of religious education, whatever that is often less addressed. The topics of religion and education are kept discreet, like uncooked ingredients on a kitchen bench. Simply buying a tin of tomatoes and a packet of pasta does not make bolognese. You need to do some stirring, some seasoning, some simmering. You, our peer reviewers, help with the simmering, with the stirring. And that mixing is what I refer to as the adjectival qualities of religion education. How is religion educational? How is education religious? So as religious education adds many new nouns to our vocabulary, Islamic nouns, Gita nouns, Indonesian nouns, Kazakh nouns, what will ensure disciplinary coherence is scholars and reviewers asking how both education and religion are teleological human practices with potential for transcendence. And that's the kind of question that's been at both the past and at the future of religious education. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their practical wisdom and their insights, and for sparking, if you've not seen it inside the chat, lots of questions or lots of conversation, just in ideas. People are spouting up ideas, and I appreciate the kind of energy that I feel in this virtual room. I'm like, I feel it in the room. With regard to publication and the idea of research and scholarship and the way that it goes forth in religious education. At this time, we want to invite some conversations from our attendees to all of our panelists. And you can either, if you would like to grab the mic, you'll see the mic icon, I think, down in the bottom of your screen. And also you can put a question into the chat if you would like, and I can speak it into the room. Either way, at this time, do we have any questions about publications or any further ideas that we want to pursue? While we're waiting for a question, of course, from that's why I'm the moderator. I get to ask my questions first. While we're waiting for questions from the audience, I wanted to also begin to help us to kind of think about some of the things that we've seen happening or emerging in this. In terms of some of the questions that I see now emerging in the chat are really questions of, since the pandemic has kind of begun, or in like what we've think both, I think there's a logistic question of, have we seen submissions drop during the pandemic, or are there any challenges that we're seeing specifically that are pandemic related in religious education, scholarship, and research? Any of you could respond.
I can probably take that question. So it's complicated by the fact that in the year of the pandemic, we also changed our schedule of publication, and we went to a larger page size shortly before that, which means there's a little bit more space in the journal. And we rearranged the time when we usually get many more submissions, from right after the conference in November to the summertime, when we don't usually have a whole lot until September, when everybody gets back from their writing work over the summer, at least for U.S. folks. I know that I'm speaking seasonally in a North American context. Forgive me, Aaron. So I think that has changed things. But here's the main thing. Submission numbers are not down so much. What is different is that it's been harder to get peer reviewers in a timely way because of overwhelm. I mean, I can think of many, many people who had to say they couldn't review something right now because they're homeschooling their child because the schools are closed, and they're working from home, and 2011 other things are going on, and peer review just isn't a possibility. And that's perfectly understandable. But it has meant that we've had a little bit of a slowdown in some of the pipeline for getting things through the publication process.
I would just add to that. I think that is a parallel problem in book reviews, or a challenge, is people signing up to do book reviews before the pandemic, or if you were like me in those moments where you work from home and you're like, wow, I have so much time now that I don't have to walk an hour to go to work. I'm going to take on a new project, and then realizing this is not sustainable after 3 weeks. I'm totally understanding of the fact that things come up and priorities shift, especially over the past couple of years. So I would just say that's one of the other things. That being said, with publication schedules, there's still a ton of great books that are coming out. So it's a little bit harder to find reviewers right now, especially because usually at an REA meeting, the book review editor, that's how I first started writing book reviews, goes to the doctoral student breakfast with a pile of books that they have collected over the years, and literally gives them away in exchange for a review. That's harder to do when the books are electronic, when we're meeting electronically, when we're not connected in the same way.
I forgot to unmute myself. I am so sorry. I'm doing too many things. And also, as Joyce has noted, we're both in Connecticut and our houses are shaking and our outside is just, there's a tornado coming or a tropical storm close by. So if at any moment we lose, internet connectivity, that is so be it, such as conferencing in 2021. Well, I was looking into the chat. We have a question from a PhD student or a comment from a PhD student. And I don't know if you wanted to grab the mic and speak that into the room or if we would want to take a few moments to respond. So it's like Reem is writing that I like the earlier comment made about not being reactionary in scholarship and from the perspective of Islamist education. I would say that it is important to have regular, consistent, positive narrative of Muslim and Islam available to people by way of religious education to counter the rhetoric in the media. Would anybody also like to think about, as we're considering publications or even the current conversations that we're seeing either in the pipeline, how we might continue to have this ongoing positive conversation instead of just a reactionary kind of approach to scholarship and research about Islamic education?
Well, I'll reiterate the point is we have to be inviting Muslim scholars into these conversations. And yes, it's important to have a regular narrative of Islamic conversation in our journal. But it's not simply going to be a positive versus negative thing. It's going to be complex. The Islamic tradition's complex, just like any faith tradition. And it's to echo something Hosffman said at the very start of the panel. It's important that we engage with these ideas. So if they're not to be reactionary, we've got 5 or 6 essays in an issue. We need, in subsequent issues, for people to be citing those ideas and engaging with them or engaging with them in other venues so that the conversation gets layered. Otherwise, it just exists and then disappears. And we feel good about ourselves that we've been diverse because we've published on Kazakh identity in China, but no one in the association or the journal has engaged with that idea.
That's helpful. Jose?
No, I just want to say that's why making the point of going, once you decide to publish in the journal, going back to the journal before submitting to review what has been written in the last issues. That's where we can start that conversation that Jack was talking about before, about listening to each other and having the conversation, and try to use the articles as support, to support your arguments or to quote. I think it's a good practice for everyone.
So one of the questions that I also, I'm sorry, Aaron, you wanted to respond again? Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I'm looking for peer reviewers, often I will look into the bibliography and look at whose work they've cited, and if, as Jose was saying, if it's something that's been in religious education, and something recent, we're going to go to that person as a potential reviewer. So that's the way, as editors, we're trying to facilitate the matchmaking.
And yes, and I think the other thing, I think there's so much to be said about how we expand or even think about the questions of internationalization and globalization and even the diversity that is the scholarship that is in our publications and in our guild, as well as I love the way you were talking about it, Aaron, the expanding conversation or field of religious education, which the boundaries are not always there. And I think for me in particular, that's one of the gifts of the field, but it's not always necessarily reflected fully in a lot of the North American centric and Christocentric conversations that we're having in the Guild. One of the other things that I wanted to think about or ask you to wrestle with today while other questions are coming into the comments are about something that was prompted in the beginning part of the panel or the first third of the conversation, where we were talking about the need to not only read the publications that are out there and to encourage the generation of them, but to cite each other. And one of the things, of course, that gets my juices churning and thinking about this is, what does it mean for us to not just be in conversation as solo, isolated scholars, but to imagine a world of collaborative scholarship or collaborative conversation? And what might that look like with all of the challenges that brings and with all of the limitations of what is required for tenure and publication and promotion? But what might we think about as the ideas or the future of collaborative research in RE? Or any thoughts or ideas? Hanan wants the mic.
It's a little dark here. Sorry about that, I hope you can see me. Maybe I'll just turn off the screen and you can just hear me. So one of the areas that might help us move along into some of the challenges that Jack put before us about interacting with educational research is involving the learning sciences. The learning sciences is probably the fastest growing field of education today. And I say this now, Almeda, in relation to your comment and question, because one of the characteristics of the learning sciences and the way in which they have, in amazing ways, developed ways of doing collaborative research. So that if you look at the work that's being published in the learning sciences, it's usually, a long list of names of people that have worked together, and not only in somebody's lab, but on somebody's project. And they're all over the place because they're sitting just like we're sitting here on screens, working with one another. So one thought might be, for example, to have a theme of the journal, a themed issue on the learning sciences. I could, have a guy in mind that might actually be able to take that up, the learning sciences and religious education, and then try and pull a bunch of people and use that as an example of how the learning sciences can offer us ways to do collaborative research, so we don't end up as these solo scholars, end up sort of bringing people together in communities of research, which I think would just shoot us forward and accomplish a bunch of different goals all at one time.
Thanks so much for that, Hanan. Other questions or comments about collaborative research or even about the learning sciences as a partner? Jack, you're unmuted.
Yeah. Almeda, I want to add, I think one of the things we need to do is to have a task force that will publish a document about what does publication in religious education look like. And what I mean by that is, when I served as an academic dean 20 years ago, a lot of my colleagues would not allow anything that had been published in an online journal to count for promotion. We had to establish that there were quality online journals. And you all know there are a bunch of them out there now. And then we had to write it into our faculty handbook. I think the reality is the future is going to be podcasts that are significant, interactive, collaborative conversations that are both written and published. We need to help our institutions expand their awareness of what is a publication, because until we do that, we're all tied real hard. We're tied to the old articles and books, and the old articles and books in the standard journals, which take so much time and take us away from the kind of creativity that we could have. So for REA to think about, what does publication, you see my quotation marks, look like in the field that would be addressed to our institutions internationally, I think would be a really important contribution.
That's so helpful. Other thoughts or ideas? And I think I'm looking also in the comments, so I think Khalid had also talked about part of the issue or one of the challenges with collaborative research and scholarship is to really think about what is required of the tenure promotion process, and at the same time mixing in some ways with a comment by Mayan talking about the fact that the hill for emergent scholars is getting steeper and steeper and steeper in terms of what is required and what is kind of like available or out there. How might we encourage both emerging scholars, but even seasoned scholars to advocate or to think about the types of work that might be moving the needle? Because, for example, I love the idea, Jack, that you speak of in terms of podcasts or significant podcasts and things being scholarship. And we also have, we have fields that are talking about digital humanities and public facing scholarship and things like that. But we're in some ways living in a liminal space where we want to move it forward, but sometimes committees, institutions are slow to catch up with that. So how do we encourage scholars to in some ways do this both and work or to live in this space?
I'm really appreciative of the both and language because I don't think that we help newer scholars and underrepresented scholars from underrepresented contexts and people groups to show up in educational settings by taking away a venue that they now have for publication that will count in their places. So I think we need to keep doing that. And we need to have these other things going on. Here's the problem. Somebody has to shepherd it. Okay, we have tried for a number of years now to get author videos attached. We can do this with Taylor and Francis on our website. We have a way to put author short little introductions on there. We can't get it to happen because there's work involved, and who has time, right? So I don't want to throw cold water on dreaming big dreams, but just to say, as Mary said, Mary Hess in her comment, this is not a new idea that we should be doing things electronically and get out of print mode only and sort of change some of the language and vocabulary and process of our scholarship. But we need some people to step up to the plate and take it on. So that's just a reality.
And I would add that whilst it's exciting to talk about digital and podcasts, our journal's been around for 116 issues. It's got credibility for what it is. And for emerging scholars, there's some gravitas that goes with being in the journal rather than in something new. You can debate whether that's legitimate or not, but there's value for them. That's why we get a lot of submissions, people that want to be in these pages because of what it represents and because of the work that has appeared in these pages over a century.
And that's important. And I think that's in some ways, that's the tension that I was naming in terms of the liminal space of really wanting us to not ever lose the gift and the longevity of the publication series that we've been working through and the venues that we have, because they are important. And I think there's also a way that I think Aaron was also speaking to this in terms of the peer review process being a shepherding process or a way of allowing some of those things to marinate and come together in a better conversation and to try to really think about that work. Looking though at the ideas though, I just want to also to kind of think about if we have one kind of final word from each of you in terms of either the future or in terms of one thing that we might say, if I could dream big or push for practicality, either direction you want to go in. One concluding thing, because we're at 5:20, and so I want to really give us an opportunity to kind of name and kind of close, if you will, on our concluding wisdom.
I'll echo what Dave said. If you would like to be a reviewer, contact us. We love to have your name on our catalog, our roster. So for book reviews or for reviewing articles, and for me, particularly if it's areas outside of the Christian space, I'd love to be in contact with reviewers.
Thank you, Aaron.
Let me just add and encourage the fact that mentoring is occurring in our field all of the time. The reviewers, peer reviewers of journal articles, in their feedback that goes back to authors, that helps mentoring and helps create better articles. We intentionally in Horizons will provide a mentor. And I know that there are 50 or 60 people, seriously, that belong to our organization. If you ask them to look at your article, they'll tell you whether they have time or not to do it. So we've just got, in some ways, to reach out and risk, because that mentoring is really there and it's possible. Maybe we need to more formalize it, but I know it's there and it's possible.
Thank you so much for that, Jack, and for the reminder that mentoring is always happening. Joyce.
Given that we continue to write for and produce scholarship for ourselves, so there's an in-house conversation going on, but the demand is increasingly for our work to get into the public square, it also means that we need to do the editing read of our own work with the eyes of somebody who doesn't know our insider vocabulary. And so one of the big issues is, if I write this article and somebody in Botswana picks it up and reads it, are they going to know what I mean when I say flipped classroom? Maybe. Maybe they know better than I do, but maybe not. I couldn't think of a more idiomatic thing right now, but we get a lot of that where we are having to ask authors to translate for international ears and for non-regional, non-in-house specificity. I think that's part of going public. It's a part of getting our work really out there into the widest possible readership. So I just want to really encourage you to write with that in mind. That includes also, by the way, remembering that if you mean church, say church. But if you mean faith communities, not just white Protestant congregations or evangelical Protestants in the United States South, if you mean also synagogues and temples and mosques and ashrams and, any of the other kinds of religious communities, the ways people congregate or gather to be religious people together, then don't say church. Figure out how your vocabulary needs to morph in relation to an interfaith, interreligious engagement.
That's helpful. Thank you so much for that, Joyce.
I feel like this is where I should have kept that 0.5 point that I tacked on at the end of my 3. So in addition, I'll just reiterate 2 things. One is, again, book reviews matter, and they matter when they are written with supportive affirmation and critical inquiry. The other thing is that they matter from that they're from everyone. As someone who has written books, I know how important it is to see a review of my own work. And I take that with me when I see the list. Now, I probably look at the list of books needing to be reviewed more than anyone else. But I'm always thinking, that review meant a lot to me, and I need to pay that forward by writing a review of someone else's work. So whether you are, you've been a lifetime member of REA or you're just starting out, we want you to write a review. So please consider that.
And I love the way you said it earlier, Dave, that the reviews are really a way of building the field. And so I just wanted to highlight that. Jose, any final thoughts or wisdom?
Well, thoughts, I'm not sure wisdom, but I would say that what I'm hearing in our conversation today is that whatever we're writing in the journal and also in our publications have to in some way creatively express the tensions of our identity as a field. And those tensions are real. Um, but if we are saying, for example, that we want to acknowledge that our field has a sort of a preference for collective work or wants to support individual work, it is important as a guild then to legitimize that in our conversations within our institutions so that that is validated. It cannot be separated from from the actual work that people are doing in their institutions, because we know that, as we said before, that they will be accountable for a way of doing scholarship. On the other side, we're saying, but we value this for you. Those conversations cannot happen separately. They have to come together, and it's part of our responsibility as a guild. That's above and aside the publication, to really start legitimizing this is the way our field is evolving, and this is what we value as scholarship, and that's why we publish it.
Such important words, such important conversation. I want to just say a final word of gratitude for all who have shared as attendees and as panelists for the way that you've helped us to dream about publication and the future of religious education, scholarship, and research. And for the ways that we are still going to have to keep dreaming and keep imagining new ways, or maybe a return to old ways, or ways of, imagining how to merge together many of the concerns and questions of our field, how we nurture diversity, how we continue in our public facing and international reach of religious education scholarship, and how we continue to stretch ourselves to really kind of think outside of the ways either that we've been trained to do research, or the ways that for many of us are just kind of defaulted because they're rewarded. And so it's just been really helpful to have this rich conversation with you all today. Thanks again, and good evening. I think there's a couple more sessions this afternoon or evening, whatever time zone you're in. But to everyone else, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today.